Welcome, happy Black History Month. Welcome to the first in a series of events hosted by the African and African American Studies program in the School of Social Transformation in celebration of Black culture, activism, and expressions of freedom and liberation all across the diaspora. My name is Dr. Miko Fitzward, and I'm the faculty head of African and African American Studies here at Arizona State University. What started as Negro History Week, Carter G. Woodson's homage to the intellectual study of Black life and history, has transformed into Black History Month. Dr. Woodson's vision was always much greater than the celebration of African American traditions. He championed for the full integration of Black history in public education across all levels. We see this liberatory vision in the movement for Black lives and the demands for economic equity, investments in education and health, and reparations for the past and continuing harm expressed and suffered within and among Black communities. This month, we are excited to have a dynamic series of events featuring students and scholar activists, and in the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community, we have partnered with a wide range of organizations, colleges, schools, and centers all across ASU. So we hope that you will join us throughout the month. While a certificate in African American Studies was created in 1992, 1998 marks the official start of the African and African American Studies Department, which it was known at the time, as an academic department at ASU. And this was 30 years after the movement for Black Studies began, when sociologist Dr. Nathan Hale drafted the proposal for what became the first department of Black Studies in the nation at San Francisco State University. The call for scientific and humanistic study of African descended peoples across the diaspora came directly out of the civil rights and Black power movements, where students, faculty, staff, and community joined forces to demand intellectual space within the academy. Today, we're joined by some of the key figures who spoke truth to power and continue to speak truth to power and successfully constituted African and African American Studies here at ASU. We honor their commitments by learning about this history and remembering that the struggle continues. Let me introduce our esteemed roundtable. Dr. Stanlie James is Professor of African and African American Studies and Women and Gender Studies in the School of Social Transformation, the outgoing Vice Provost for Inclusion and Community Engagement, and a pioneering theorist and intellectual of Black feminism and Black women's studies. Reverend Dr. Sakena Young-Scaggs is an honors faculty fellow in Barrett the Honor College and newly appointed Senior Associate Dean for Religious and Spiritual Life and Minister of Memorial Church at Stanford University. Alonzo Jones is Associate Athletic Director of Inclusion and Championship Life for Sun Devil Athletics. And Aniyah Braveboy is a senior majoring in public service and public policy in the W.P. Carey School of Business, president of the Black African Coalition, student representative on the Advisory Council on African American Affairs, and a recipient of ASU's Committee for Campus Inclusion's 2020 Catalyst Award. Let's begin today's conversation with a little history lesson from Dr. James. Dr. James, we know that student activism is a critical part of the history of Black studies as a field and discipline in higher education. As former chair and director of African and African American Studies, tell us about this history and the ways that our field has been connected to and was born out of movements for intersectional racial justice.
Well, let me first start and say thank you very much for inviting me to come. I do want to make sure that people are aware that there's Black studies did not just begin in the 1960s, and you have, tipped your hat to that by talking about Carter G. Woodson. But I do think we need to have a little shout out to some of the other people that were involved in it. So basically, I want to suggest that there's about 3 or 4 stages of Black history. The first one really began around in the 1890s and went on through to about World War II. Um, and that's when we had early kind of Black literary and historical associations and organizations, things like the Philadelphia American Negro Historic Society or the Washington, D.C. American Negro Academy. And you have to remember Negro was the appropriate terminology at that time. Um, and then we also have to really pay homage to W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1987 launched a program at Atlanta University to examine the various categories of African Americans in 10-year cycles. Now, Du Bois, if you know anything about him, he was nothing if not visionary. He decided this project should be 100 years long, okay, and it should be 10-year cycle. He almost lived that long, but at any rate, he thought that they needed to, the scholars needed to study Black families, churches, social organizations, economic development, everything that you could think of about Black life. And at AU, Atlanta University, between 1898 and 1914, the scholars produced 16 monographs on these topics. And the people that were engaged in this project over this amount of time were heavy hitters, and also into the 20th century, including people like E. Franklin Frazier, Ralph Bunche, Charles S. Johnson, and Sterling Brown, along with Du Bois. And they produced an impressive amount of literature or an impressive body of scholarship that was designed to correct the errors, the omissions, and the distortions of Black life and history that really prevailed throughout this time and even up to today among white academics and the American public. So, I mean, we do have that as a background, and we need to remember that, even though, the 1960s and on are very important. We also had Gunnar Myrdal coming out in about the 1940s with his 2-volume study that was called An American Dilemma, the Negro Problem of Modern Democracy. And that set the stage for a lot of conversation or scholarship from World War II on into the 1960s. So when we get to this business of the student movement, um, I think what you have to recognize is that the student movement sort of took off in the middle of the 1960s, around 19 and up to about 1969. And one of the things that gets lost in this that I think is extremely important is that this movement comes out of the Black Power movement. So it is a movement that starts out with strikes. It is a movement that has a lot of violence involved in it. And oftentimes we don't hear about it. I spent many years at the University of Wisconsin, and I've been thinking about it because this year Wisconsin is celebrating, the Afro-American Studies Department is celebrating its 50th anniversary. So it came not long after 1969 when San Francisco State was established. So what the Black students were asking for was they wanted, first of all, a curriculum that actually challenged the normalization of Europeanized curricula. They were determined that we had to do something other than that. And to that end, they had strikes. So the thing that I think is important to know is that some of those strikes, again, became very violent. So, for example, at the University of Wisconsin on February 13th, 1969, and I say that because we're so close to, an anniversary date for that. At Wisconsin, they went on strike, but they were met with just unbelievable a response. First from the city police, and then they called in something like 900 National Guardsmen who strolled on campus with bayonets on top of their, guns. There were another 300 that were riding around, I think it was, with Jeeps, those Jeeps, and they had mounted guns on their Jeeps. And all of this because Black students had led a crowd of something like 10,000 students down State Street from the university to the state, capitol. And that's a hike, I know, because I've walked it many times. But, and it was cold because it was February in Wisconsin. But they did that, and the people, the power structure went off on them. Meanwhile, there were white racists on campus who were strolling about with H armbands around their arms in support of Hayakawa. You remember, who was the president of the University of California, Berkeley, and who also was an alumni of UW-Madison, and who met strikers with violence and was gleeful publicly about how that was the best day he ever had, was watching students getting beaten up by, police and National Guard. So I could go on and on about that, but I won't. I just want you to know that that was the case. And what you also need to know is that there were something like, across the country, something like 13 people were killed in these student strikes. 9 college students, 3 high school students, and 1 community activist. Hundreds were arrested, charged with felonies. Thousands were beaten, sent to the hospital. Thousands more were expelled from schools. So this is the part of I think the story that we don't always hear about. And it's important to know that it took, blood, sweat, and tears to bring these departments into being, these departments and programs into being. And I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to stop here, and I'll be open for additional questions. But we need to know that this is an ongoing thing. And by the way, one last thing, you need to know that Blacks were not united on this. So you had people like, I think Bayard Rustin, who talked about, he didn't know why we needed to do this. Roy Wilkins said it was segregation, that we were trying to resegregate ourselves. Thurgood Marshall said it was nothing but Black anarchy. So even the elders of the Black community were not always in support of the work that these students were trying to do. So.
Thank you, Dr. James. You referenced the connection to the larger Black Power movement. And I want to turn to Reverend Dr. Young-Scaggs, ASU's, I think many of us see you as ASU's resident griot when it comes to the keeping and the passing down of stories about Black student activism. In fact, your voice is part of the archive of this legacy. And I'm posting in the chat a 2012 interview that was published in the Journal of Pan-African Studies. So tell us about your earliest memory of Black student organizing at ASU.
My earliest memories of Black student organizing, unfortunately, is tied to the 1989, what we call the incident. And when I refer to the incident, I'm referring to a particular climate and context. The climate on the campus, while there had been Black organizing, certainly at ASU before, there was a bubbling up of racism, a bubbling up of Black anti-Black antagonism, a bubbling up of fisticuffs that would happen between Black and white students. And again, whenever we think of what's going on in a campus, we think of the microcosm of what's going on in society. Arizona at the time was in a microcosmic tension, fighting for MLK. And so it aroused at the time MLK, We were in the middle of protests. It aroused tension that was inflamed by our then governor, who, Alonzo want to go, our then governor, who repealed what was considered the MLK holiday. And so students protested, and we marched with Warren Stewart, and formed, became more engaged on campus during that larger umbrella of period of time in the Black community in Arizona. It was also, this incident was an incident, and I want to say sometimes things are gendered, truly gendered. The brothers know stuff the sisters didn't know, and the sisters knew stuff the brothers didn't know. And so the incident happened on Greek Row. It was where a young man was taken up by police officers after being attacked by Greek life, white Greek life members, and it was enough. We did not have the support of the police, ASU police at the time. There was only one Black police officer, and he watched our back. That was Brother Al Phillips. I call him brother. Al Phillips was like a big brother on campus, and he was an artist, and we loved him dearly, because he kept ourselves sane, and he watched out for us. But it was that moment when in time that everything kind of came to a head, that I remember most, or beginning of organizing, and the shift to really wanting to see some things concretely done. Really wanting to see not just a department. It wasn't just about the department. It was about the climate. It was about our presence. It was also about having what I call Black chair professors slowly disappear. And what we call Black chair professors were Black professors that were leaving ASU. We would call them vanishing professors. They were there one year and gone the next. And that was a challenge. Professors such as VP Franklin, professors like Wanda Hendricks. Two professors stand out though, that I want to mention their names. We talk about say their names, speak their names, is Michael Mitchell, and who has passed on, and Moses Moore, Eminem and Eminem. Those two professors were the in-class activist educators for us. Dr. Michael Mitchell taught political science, African-American politics 150. And many of our students, we met in that class. We engaged in that class. The other in class was Moses Moore, who was a religious scholar, but he taught a class called Malcolm and Martin. And so again, the synergy at the time when we were in class learning revolutionary history, we were also experiencing this kind of pressure in the climate on campus. And so that was some of the beginnings. Now, each of us were in our organizations. I was not at the time a member of Delta Sigma Theta, but I was a member of NAACP. AKAs were very active on campus. We know AKA more now in the national spotlight from our vice president. But what's known as the Divine Nine, or the Panhellenic Council, were the 9 Greek organizations: Alpha Phi Alpha, Omega Psi Phi, Phi Beta Sigma, etc. And so of the Divine Nine, we had about 7 strong presence on the campus who began to form connections along with other student Black organizations. And of those other student Black organizations, we would meet by the fountain, which no longer is on campus. It's there, but it's not running. The fountain outside of the MU. We would meet at the student service building, and we'd have these meetings, and then we'd meet at late night places that nobody knew about as well. And so we used the strategies that we were taught by our elders to begin to organize on the campus after that incident.
Thank you, thank you. And AJ, as an undergrad, you were instrumental in organizing students. And I think one of the things to point out is, you know, Sakena and AJ were undergraduate students. They're now faculty and administrators here at the university, right? So they are still part of this beloved community here. And AJ, Tell us a little bit about your fondest moments and what were some of the efforts that you remember that really led to changes here at ASU, particularly for Black students?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Miko. And I'm real glad to kind of take this trip down memory lane with y'all a little bit, in preparation for the conversation. I'm trying to get my dates right and kind of when certain things were. And I say that because I have probably two relationships to our university. So in 1986, I came as an undergrad student, a first generation kid, largely sort of grappling with a biracial identity and intentionally over the course of the summer choosing to infuse a Blackness into my own development at Arizona State University. And that was largely in part because of an organization called STARS, Students Taking Action to Reach Success, which was created probably in spring 85, but the first class was 1986. And I was a member of the first class of STARS. And I remember fondly at my home in Las Vegas, Nevada, receiving a phone call from someone in STARS. Key figures there were Deborah Brohard, who was the advisor to STARS, and a gentleman named Kevin Fuller. Kevin Fuller should be a part of any kind of conversation about back in the day. And they reached out to me. And this was the first time that someone reached out to me because I was Black, or in that time, biracial, one drop rule. I was in the Black family. And so ASU did a beautiful thing to me, that it gave me an identity or membership even before meeting me. That was very interesting conceptually for me. And so, and that just squared with my intentionality kind of on a Black experience. And so I spent 5 years as an undergrad, largely nurtured in the freshman year through a Black freshman-centered organization. My sophomore year, the latter part of my freshman year, I got turned on to a fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, which was another opportunity for me to sort of be impressed, Mako, Dr. Ward, to be impressed, Anaya, with men who were relatively only a few years older than me, but they impressed me to the point to where I did not know what they were a member of, but clearly they were a part of something, and they moved in ways that were age appropriate. They carried themselves with a certain kind of confidence and a certain kind of rootedness in culture and rootedness in programming, and they were impressive. And so I kind of tracked that way and became a member of Alpha Phi Alpha in my sophomore year. And that largely shaped my experience from an organizational perspective. I graduated in 1991. Then perhaps what connects me most to the conversation is I was an employee at ASU working in the Office of Admissions from 1991 through 1993. I still had close contact with a lot of the activists, what I'll call, the Ashad Trishes, the Jeremy Levitts, the Bernard Bonners, folks that were kind of in my era, but I was a little bit older. So we still had connection. And so I played a lot of kind of advice, kind of a counseling kind of perspective. But there's two things I would want to note. There's activists where you are targeting someone because there's deficit, there's inequity, there's things that can be better, and they have some power in order to make it better. The other part of activism that ASU was very, very poignantly for me is that it was largely in this space of self-determination. We were constantly competing against each other to see who could put out the best program, who could put on the best party, who could sort of, walk that balance between academic excellence and cultural knowledge. I remember some of my most fondest memories after programs. And a side note, and Anaya, this is interesting to you, there was no, we weren't aware of appropriations. There were little pockets of money here and there where you could nickel and dime something together, but you didn't really have a robust budget. And so you were always creatively finding ways to make money. Back in them days, we made monies off a party, and then we take that money raised for a social activity and we put it into programming. We brought 1001 inventions, and these were moments of high accomplishment, a lot of high self-determination, and a lot of personal fulfillment, but in a very narrow kind of Black space. Like I like to jokingly say, I had an historically Black college experience at ASU until I went to class. That means we're a very, very insulated community There wasn't a whole lot of infighting among the organizations, although we did bump heads at times, but there was a community. It was accessible in large part because it was very few African Americans at the university in the mid 80s upwards towards the latter part. So my fondest memory was tapping into a Black intelligentsia, certainly under the mentorship of Dr. Moore, who was a critical piece to me, man. When I took his class and read Slave Religion, I was boom. So it was this age of discovery, and so there was high appreciation for the Blackness that was punctuated in a predominantly white space. And much of my undergrad experience, although it was highly aware of the 1989 incident, it was highly aware of the activism that was occurring directly with the president, President Russell at the time, and then Crow and Provost Glick. When I began to work at the university, I would sit around some of the table in terms of committees and whatnot. But it was also very much time, it was sort of pre-Malcolm X hat, but we were on the verge of that. And there was this ultra Blackness, man, that it was beautiful. And it was an opportunity of coming of age, largely through organization, largely through community, with scattered mentors. Dr. Carter, name has to be mentioned. He was the first administrator I met, Black male. Jim Hill, Tennessee State graduate. My father's second wife went to Tennessee State. There was a connection there. And so it wasn't organized or structured, but all of us found ourselves in their offices, just kind of sitting at the feet. And I have to believe collectively on the back end, they were taking some kind of macro survey of the pulse of the campus community, and that they too, as administrators and faculty, played a role in the acceleration of what was sort of general studies, certificate program, and then the evolution of the department.
Thank you. Now, in order for us to truly have an intergenerational conversation about this, I want to bring Anaya into the conversation. And I again want to encourage folks to take a look at that essay, that the link is in the chat, to learn more about the detailed history of who the players are, who the organizations were, who the administrators at ASU were that actively worked in support, and sometimes not so much in support of these efforts, right? And we know that the Black African Coalition was founded in 1992 out of a series of plans, right? There was the 13-point plan, there was a 14-point plan, right? But these plans were generated by Black students, and out of those efforts and demands, the BAC was born. And this year, the BAC has done so much under your leadership, the BAC as a collective of Black student organizations across ASU, to advocate for the inclusion of student voices in this sort of structural change work that we're seeing happening now as a result of the 2020 racial reckoning. So Anaya, tell us a little bit about some of the efforts that you've been involved with, that you've initiated. And I also want to sort of emphasize that I've seen Anaya speak on many occasions, and she often talks about this issue of accountability, how campus administrators need to be held accountable. So all of this work that BAC is doing is to, in many ways, in that spirit of accountability, speak truth to power. So tell us about that amazing work.
Of course. Thank you for having me today, Dr. Ward. Always love being in your presence. But in the movement towards promoting inclusion at ASU, the BAC has first, tried to have many conversations with administration and ASU PD. But however, we soon noticed that we could not trust administration, as they were not following through with a lot of the promises that they made. So the BAC took the initiative to create our own scholarship and tour. Within the last 4 months, we were able to create the first scholarship that is for Black students at ASU. And it'll help with releasing that financial burden of an ASU education. The tour that we recently announced is for prospective Black students, as a lot of the Black students that attend ASU feel as if they're alone. They don't know about the BAC, they're not exposed to the many resources or programming that is available for minority students at ASU. And we also created a booklet that'll assist students in finding the different resources, programming, resources and organizations that are here for their success and benefit. But one thing that the BAC has also advocated for is following the announcement of the Advisory Council on, African and African American affairs, the Black community has been burdened with, educating non-Black faculty, staff, and students of our struggles and oppressions. And that is something that Black students should not feel obligated to do. We shouldn't have 1,000 surveys sent to our emails to educate ASU on how they're oppressing us, one, but then also oppressing Black staff and faculty with trying to come up with different programmings for, for their need, for their inclusion and diversity initiatives. So that's some things that BAC has been working on. But as for being accountable, when I first took on my presidency back in March of 2020, the BAC had a series of different conversations with administration. And we soon noticed that, administrators can be very strategic with their words. So they're not exactly answering your question. So, they're just giving you enough to pass you over, or they put you in this humongous puddle of gray area. And as a person that's very Black and white, I follow through. I need details. I need you to tell me this timeline. And they weren't producing that. So BAC had to go public with a lot of the stuff that we were going through. We would have conversations with administration, and then we would wait about a month and nothing would come of it. So then we began to calling them out on their bluff. And that's something that's been very, very successful with the BAC, as we are trying to move towards this campus that actually promotes diversity and inclusion. And with using ASU's charter against ASU, we've been able to truly practice diversity and inclusion, but also get the assistance and the recognition that we deserve. And so following all of those meetings and all of those long conference calls, the BAC really is in a happy state with everything that we've been able to push and initiate this year. So yeah, and as a lot of our students have dealt with racism at ASU, and as I've personally dealt with racism in one of ASU's classrooms, I just refuse to have another Black student experience what I did. So that's why we've been working so hard to, truly hold administration accountable with, trainings and ASU PD, and making sure that they receive the training that they need so we can eliminate implicit bias. So we just want to make sure our Black students are protected and heard while they're having, while they're able to retrieve an education at ASU.
Absolutely. And the point about, the students are here, the students have historically done this work, but this should not be the burden of the students, right? That this should be held by a larger collective. And we know that historically that it's the collective of efforts of Black students, staff, faculty, and community that creates the conditions for structural change. And we often call this, inside of our spaces, we talk about this as the Underground Railroad of our collective network, right? So one final question for the panel: how can this underground network of support, how can we continue to support each other in our collective efforts, both sort of behind the scenes, but also public facing? How do we support each other towards racial justice, equity, and inclusion at ASU? Anyone on the panel?
I want to start, but I'll come back. But I want to also address this piece that Anaya brought up in terms of accountability. Historically, accountability, you're right, this work has been done by students, and there has been a shift, and it's been wonderful to see. Students have had to stay longer, and do the work, and hope that they would find someone to mentor and take their place. And again, this notion of replacing ourselves, so that when we move on, we have someone else, another foot soldier, so to speak, doing the work. But part of that accountability is connections and trust across faculty, staff, students. And sometimes they don't speak to each other. Sometimes it's just getting a slew of emails. And so there has to be more intentionality within the ASU network so that the students know who the faculty is. I mean, and know who they're fighting for. okay? Because you have to understand when the students are fighting, they're fighting to retain, because retention and recruitment was a star part of the foundations of the BAC. And so we're fighting for recruitment and retention. That's what the students are battling for, but also the community. One of the prongs that I think has been lost, although that some certainly infrastructure has been strengthened on campus, is the off-campus prong, the community prong. Some of that work AJ is doing, Alonzo is doing through his community work. Others are doing some work, such as Kiana Sears doing some community work. But I think we have to be very intentional on recognizing the historic community ties, such as that of Jim Hill, who was part of, not only the fraternity, but also part of the community linkages. Calvin Good, I always want to give Calvin Good his props, not only because he walked me down the aisle and I love him and he's a member of my church, but he bought stuff for us for BAC. He made sure we ate. He was behind the scenes providing in a way and wisdom in a way that should not be missed. The other was Leon Sullivan. Leon Sullivan, who we know from the Sullivan Principles and the anti-apartheid movement. He was also very instrumental in the foundations of the BAC and students. So as a result of that, when the students needed a community, yes, they had the Art Carters and the Charlene Coles and the Deborah Broharts and the Bernie Jackson on campus, but they also had a lineage outside of campus so that those people on campus were not the only ones risking, right? So we had the Jim Hills and the Calvin Goods, but we also had the Leon Sullivans. We also had the George Dean and Dr. Blue, who was part of classic organizations such as NAACP and Urban League. So it was this coalition outside that if the students fell apart, the community could pick them up. And that was the beginning of what we call the campus environment team. And I want to articulate that. Now it's, again, institutionalized. What is it called now? The CCI?
The campus committee for inclusion, campus committee for inclusion.
Right. That was the campus environment team, but that was the outside looking in and making sure that the campus environment was safe for students of color. I don't think we have that kind of campus environment team. We can call them advisory board, we can call them mentors, but it's also about accountability and intentionality. We have to be intentional, I believe, in the future to have that kind of exchange in the community.
Miko, could you just succinctly restate the question? I'm balancing handymans and all this kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How do we all continue to support each other? Because we know often the interests of faculty, staff, and students are diverse, they're unique, they're distinct, but we are part of, I'll continue to use this phrase, we are part of the beloved community. So how can we continue to do that? And in fact, I want to address, there's a question in the chat from Professor Kelly Jackson over in the School of Social Work. How can attendees help carry this heavy burden in holding ASU leadership accountable to create and sustain Black affirming spaces? So it's the question about accountability and a question about how we all can work collaboratively in these efforts.
Yeah. So briefly, let me be a bit Pollyannish maybe, but I honestly get a strong sense that the community has deep care for itself, student to faculty, faculty to student, staff to student, even extended community. The one thing that really impresses me about Arizona is more like Cheers, where everybody knows your name. And I know everybody doesn't know your name, but this is not the Mecca, this is not Chicago, this is not Atlanta. We got about 125,000 or 200,000 some folks in the Phoenix metropolitan core area. And prior to COVID, when we're moving about, we see familiar faces, common churches, experiences, common graduate chapters. It's been my experience, and it could just be isolated, that it is a community that has a closeness and has a relative newness that we may not see in sort of older, larger populace where it's easier to click out. That is a joy for me to live in Arizona. And so I would say in many regards, it's there. I would want to acknowledge that. But of course, how do we continue to collectively grow? One literal platform to do that, and this is directly the work of Anaya and the BAC and the contemporary youth movement, is that there's a 25-point plan. It's called LIFT right now. And we may have our critiques of it. We may have our particular considerations around it, but there's an invitation to become involved, and please come involved. I'm involved in 6 of them, and we need some help. It's cross area, it's cross department, it's cross status in terms of employment. And so come on in and roll your sleeves up. For as far as I can tell, it's not lip service. We have weekly accountable deliverable reporting, and we're shooting towards July to articulate how we've advanced on it. And so, it's an interesting time. I would also say there's a generational lens. If you were to say 1986, when I came to Arizona State University, and I was looking at it and interpreting it with relatively young eyes, and then you look into 1995, and you look into 2005 and 2015, it's a different kind of institution. As someone that was involved over 4 decades, I'm at a place where I'm like, man, there's a lot of stuff positively going on right now. But new eyes get in the picture, and they ask different kinds of questions. They pose different kinds of challenges. And now we're dealing with a new response towards truly getting close to social equity and justice. Or we're not getting close, but at least trying to make a gallant effort on that. And that's kind of where we kind of galvanize. But I would invite a certain kind of optimism collectively. I would invite a certain kind of get out there and learn and meet students where they're at. Students meet faculty and community members where they're at, and kind of move through this space with the uniqueness that is ours, that we are not so robust that we can get lost, that we have pockets of community, we have pockets of organization, we have a strong history here in terms of Blackness, not only at ASU, but in the Phoenix metro area. There's a uniqueness to Arizona that I think can bond us in ways that are constructive and allow us to continue to have positive momentum in terms of what I'll call multicultural uplift, but also Black specificity uplift, right? To sort of move through the world with multiple identities, but also uncompromising love and loyalty to this beautiful thing called Blackness, right? So as we fight the argument, as we fight kind of the other, and we talk to the other, right? That's important, but also, hey man, love some of this. Love and learn about some of this, touch and feel some of this. That's one thing that the 80s taught me, man. This is beautiful. And all my work has been kind of working in support of lifting that up. Now we got new conversations by new beautiful minds. That's wonderful. Long-winded response to your question.
Yes.
So,
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Answer from a student perspective, but just come in our spaces. We constantly have a lot of conversations concerning campus inclusion and diversity and what it looks like in the eyes of a Black person. I definitely feel as if ASU tends to loop all minority students in the same little bubble, and we all deal with different oppressions. So what I may go through is different from a Latina person or Native American person, etc. So just coming in our spaces, understanding where we're at, and really having the representation and making yourself available to students. That'll assist in trying to create some type of bond and trust between administration and the student body.
Mm-hmm. There's one question in the chat that I just wanted to raise, and it has to do with ASU Now's new union for students, faculty, and staff. And the question is, how can the union help support the Black African American student, staff, and faculty in their struggles on campus? I just wanted to note the question because I definitely think it speaks to what I'm hearing many of the panelists say, is that there are spaces where we're all doing our respective work, but it's important that we know who we are and what those spaces are, right? So the African and African American Faculty Staff Association, the BAC, right? The Faculty Women of Color Caucus. There are all these different spaces where faculty, staff, and students are doing our respective organizing. And part of it is a matter of having an awareness that these spaces exist. And as Reverend Jonathan Young-Scaggs posted in the comments, another very important student activist voice from ASU's past. The experiences of Black students at ASU, it's a story that's on a continuum, right? The water, as he says, the water flows past some and they act on it. The same water flows past others and no action is taken. And it's important that students become politically and socially aware of these streams of existence, right? We have to know the past, understand it, in order to not recreate the wheel for the kinds of struggles that students, faculty, and staff are facing moving forward. So right now we have a bit of a surprise. I want to honor two of our panelists, and this is in the spirit of Black joy and Black thrivance. I want to close this event by celebrating Dr. Stanlie James and Reverend Dr. Sakena Young-Scaggs. Dr. James is retiring this semester. She is transitioning into the beauty of emeritus faculty life. And Reverend Sakena is journeying to Stanford University, where her work will benefit a new community of Black scholars. So at this point, I want to welcome my colleagues in the School of Social Transformation, Dr. Lisa Anderson, Associate Professor and Deputy Director of the school, and Dr. Ursula J. Orr, Lincoln Professor of Ethics and Associate Professor in SST. Welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you so much. This has really been just a wonderful event. And I want to thank Anaya, AJ, and Reverend Dr. Young-Scaggs and Dr. James for their comments and their presence and their contributions to ASU as a whole, and specifically to Black students, faculty, and staff at ASU. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I have a few words to say about my friend and colleague and former student, Reverend Dr. Young-Scaggs. I first met Sakena when she was teaching for AAAS as a faculty associate and was considering getting her PhD in gender studies. I quickly discovered we had friends in common thanks to her previous position at Brown University, where my dear friend Lewis Gordon had gone to teach. So, you know, I had to check up and like call Lewis and find out all about Sakena. And so he and his wife told me a number of like, you know, things like, yes, she's great. So since then, I've had the privilege to watch Sakena mature as a scholar and to discover her research passion. Oh, okay, passions, plural. It's both a blessing and a curse to mentor someone who is so naturally intellectually curious. But as someone who also has way too many things that I want to do at any given time, I recognize myself in Sakena. What I wish that I had, though, is Sakena's easy way of connecting to people, whether that's students or her congregations. She's found ways to translate her interest into popular classes that I think we will have a hard time making them be as captivating as she did. So after completing her PhD with an interesting and innovative study on Afrofuturism and Black Comic-Con culture, Sakena will be moving on from us to become the Associate Dean for Religious Life and the pastor of Memorial Church at Stanford University. I could not be more proud. Congratulations, Reverend Dr. Young-Scaggs. We will miss you.
Dr. Orr.
Dr. James. First, I just want to start by echoing Dr. Anderson's acknowledgments of the work, the labor, investment, and vision that went into this event. Thank you all, but particularly my colleague, Dr. Miko Ward. Thank you. This is a little, I'm not gonna lie, this is personal. That's what it is, this is personal. For anybody who might be wondering what it might be like to be a Black woman, first generation college student, first generation PhD student, first in her family to ever move all the way out west from the East Coast, having no family, having no connection, having no network other than her capacity to facilitate community on her own. I'm very thankful for those who are open enough and gracious enough. Lord God, Dr. James is so gracious enough to take us all up and under her wing. It's a fortune and blessings to know Dr. Stanlie James. I honor you, Dr. James, as a daughter, as a sister, as a mother, as a auntie, as a godmother, and as my other mother, as my other mother within the community, but also within the academy. For those of us who might not be familiar, the university discusses relationship dynamics between various individuals as kind of a maternalistic dynamic, right? You have an academic father, you have an academic mother, and at times these individuals are identified as those that we have read through and walked alongside, who have informed our thinking, our methodology, our theories, the way we understand how the world works, right? Our pedagogies. But then we also have those individuals who provide us so much more in education, guidance, wisdom, and knowledge that you can't get out of books. It's not for the bookish. And so when you're a bookish individual and you're blessed enough to come alongside, to be in the presence of another bookish individual who understands life and the world and the importance of sharing that knowledge and that wisdom and that guidance with you, because it's only through that guidance that you're able to navigate your circumstances, whether they be in life or specifically in this case with regards to the academy. And there's a lot of blend in between those two, right? A lot of times we want to separate the university from our individual lives, but we are curious Black folk searching for answers. And those questions take us to very lonely, very dark, very isolating places. So when you are blessed enough, fortune and blessings to happen upon a Stanlie James, not because you discovered her, right? Because you happen to really be looking for her. No, you're just a lost individual on this campus. But because she was looking for you. She knew you were getting there before you got there. That is so significant, Stanlie. And I don't have to tell you that, but I just need you to know that. I need you to know that. And I need you to take that with you wherever you go. And if you want a flag, I will make a flag. And if you want a t-shirt, sweetie, I will make you a t-shirt. You feel me? I will send you flowers monthly in case you happen to forget, right? Because I understand what it's like, because my mother is retired, that when you retire, you forget some things. I'm happy to remind you, Stanlie. I love you, and I'm so thankful for you that much. I'm happy to do that labor. I am thankful for the space you paid for a future the Academy could not envision, but that you and the women before you, the women who paid and prepared you for the work that you will and continue to do, did. So Dr. Stanlie James, thank you for your presence in my life, for your advocacy and investment and advisement. I look forward to sitting with you in this next season, as these are not the last of the flowers that I have for you.
Thank you. Please, in the chat, post your congratulations, post your love, and post your support for Dr. James and Reverend Dr. Young-Scaggs as they journey on, but not forgotten, here at ASU. Thank you all for attending today's event. We are going to end just a little bit early. I want to say a big thank you to our panelists, to my colleagues, to folks here in the space. Let's continue to celebrate the joy and beauty of Black culture, Black life, and Black history this month. Hopefully we will see you at other events in celebration of Black History Month, but I'm going to ask that we all transition now to support another colleague of ours, Dr. Keon McGuire, who is going to be facilitating dialogue discussion for an event hosted by the Faculty Women's Association entitled Dismantling Systemic Racism in Higher Education, an Unfinished Project. Indeed, unfinished it is. Thank you so much, and I will see you all at the next event. Have a blessed day. Bye, everyone.